The finding from this that's cool is that if you take that component and you pull it out and then you remove what I call the public research organizations, the network falls apart. In 1988, in Boston, this network was entirely dependent on universities, research institutes, teaching hospitals. What we found that's very cool is that when universities and other public research organizations are the anchors of the network, are the most dominant node, the one that provides the cohesion, just having a connection to the component raised the innovation rate of a firm. You didn't have to be central. In other words, universities were these honest brokers and neutral meeting grounds from this morning. They're anchors for a region. They're shortcuts between titularly competing organizations, and they're hubs. They open the network and allow information to flow more freely, and the result is this is a less internally competitive ecosystem that's dominated by universities. Finding one. University anchors change the way networks flow. Finding two. It's a 2006 paper. So this is a picture optimized differently of the same thing. This is Boston in 1988. You can see MIT there. 1994, 1999. This is a comparative picture of the San Francisco Bay Area. 88, 94, 99. Both of these regions grow over this time period immensely, and both of them come to be centered, the circles here, on densely interconnected networks where firms that are competitors with each other are collaborating. Right? So the networks shift from being dominated by non-biotech organizations to being dominated by collaborating biotechs who, by virtue of being simultaneously collaborative and competitive, which you might call competitive interdependence, end up exercising a degree of forbearance with each other. They end up fostering a sort of kind of relational contracting that we don't see elsewhere. What's important about this is that these two regions got to the same place on different anchors. In the Bay Area, in Boston, it was universities, as I just showed you. In the Bay Area, Stanford, for a variety of reasons, and Berkeley, play a much less active role in formalizing network ties than MIT, Harvard, and the other Boston organizations did. So they're actually fairly peripheral to this network, and what dominates it are local Bay Area venture capital firms, the Kleiner Perkins Caulfields and Byers of the world. They're the anchor that this network grew out of. And what's interesting about that is that you see they get to the same place. This is a mark of a successful region, one that goes from anchoring on one non-firm type of organization to relationships among the firms. But the different actors imprint the way companies in these networks do R&D. So we did a bunch of paired case studies, one of them of drugs for the same indication that were developed in these two regions, one just generally of patenting and licensing. It turns out that in Boston, biotech firms are much more likely to cite public sector science. They're much more likely to cite their competitors' work. They're more likely to pursue orphan drug innovations and NDAs for products, even products that are the same as the ones that are being done in Silicon Valley, where NDAs for orphan drugs aren't being pursued. In other words, the sort of open architecture of a university-based region compared to a venture capital-based region creates these local institutions and incentives that focus companies on different styles, not necessarily different products, but different styles of innovation and marketing. Right? The other thing to say here is these are two success cases. We've seen a lot of lack of success cases where regions don't get off the ground because the initial anchors don't cede control, right? Don't allow the rising tide of new types of firms to collaborate with each other. They hold on tight. You see this most obviously in the New York financial firms, right? But also around Nutley, New Jersey, where classic pharmaceutical firms had something to say about the funding industry. Finding two. Last one. Oh, finding three. So this is a bit of a transition. This is a new product. We're no longer talking specifically about biotech. This is a project that looks at the evolution of alliances in 5 sectors: biotech and drugs, hardware, software, medical devices, and a catch-all category called analytic services, basically contract labs, testing, reagent makers, diagnostics, stuff of that ilk. What we've done here is a first order of business. We're interested now not in whether firms innovate, but in what kinds of firms regions produce. So what we've done is created a dependent variable. It's a new paper, it's the first out of this project, so it's still preliminary stuff. But the dependent variable is the diversity index across high-tech sectors of firms that IPO in the state. Right? So there are some states that see IPOs pretty much evenly spread across the 5 industries that I talk about. There's some states that see no IPOs at all, and there's some states that concentrate pretty heavily on a single industry. We think this is important because a lot of these industries are counter-cyclical. And so when finances, money, all kinds of good stuff flows to one, it tends to flow out of the others. Regions that are capable of being centered on multiple industries look more resilient to us, which is an important thing for thinking about regional economies. We don't want to create boom and bust cycles. And there's a network that makes a difference for the level of diversity that, in this case, states can generate. But it's not a network that directly involves the high-tech firms. Here, white squares are law firms. Now, actually, yeah, squares are law firms. Circles are venture capital firms. White are organizations that are not connected to anyone. Right? The darkness of the tie describes the number of connections between a pair. A thicker, darker tie represents multiple interactions between a pair of organizations. The ties in this case are the high-tech firms. So what we've done is taken law firms and venture capital firms, local and a state, and we count a tie between them if they participated together in the IPO of a firm in one of these industries. So when law firms and venture capital firms work together, we get these networks. 2 key findings. 1, repeated ties between law firms and venture capital, deeper, stronger ties, right? Regardless of whether the firms that they're IPOing are in the state or not, are positively associated with more diversity in the state. Right? Ties between VCs that are local and ties between law firms that are local are not. In fact, a lot of ties between law firms diminish. So we haven't figured that out yet. It might be an artifact. The second finding, the more of these organizations that are part of this component, and the more cohesive the component there is, the greater the diversity. Right? The outcome, we suggest here, is that if what you're interested in is a diverse regional economic base, there's room for work to connect the local institutional infrastructure that supports and works with firms from multiple industries. That we need to think not just about having law firms and VC firms in a region, but we have to think about enticing them to work together, because that provides a sort of infrastructure that many different types of entrepreneurs can turn to. Right, what we haven't done yet is started to ask questions about how networks like this interact with the different roles of universities to drive it. But finding 3. Almost done. Given you 2 messages, 3 findings. They're more hidden in my work, some more or less interesting. I'm happy to talk with you about them. But some implications. So implication number 1 for me is that it's easy to talk about capacity. Right? Number of things, the Noah's Ark approach, we need 2 of each species so that we can continue. But that metaphor misses the fact that the 2 of each thing have to kind of get together somehow for Noah's Ark to repopulate the world. Right? So in order to understand regions, clusters, we need to think about both capacity and connections. We often don't think in those terms, at least not systematically. A key message from almost all of my work is that if you're doing regional economic development, it's not enough to have the organizations and the capacities present. You have to have systematic mechanisms to encourage local organizations to partner with each other. We sometimes miss the boat on that. We just think, of course they'll find their opportunities, but not so much. More importantly, locally, we want to foster what we call cross-institutional collaborations. We want to make sure that our venture capital firms, our venture community, is actually tied in to our legal community and our scientific community, because if they're tightly clustered with each other, within institutions, but not across them, we don't get this cohesive community. We don't get the benefit of building an infrastructure that supports diversity. We need to beware or be aware of anchor imprints. which means that any organization, any region that has strong incumbents, right, that are necessary to enroll in the early stages of regional development, right, we need to have mechanisms, plans, thoughts about how to help them facilitate a handoff. Right? This is a real challenge. I live in Southeast Michigan. Right? There is nothing you can do fundamentally in some ways. Marvin might tell me differently, but from my perspective at the bottom of the university, there's almost nothing you can do in Southeast Michigan that doesn't have to involve the auto industry. But having involved the auto industry, it's very, very hard to convince them to step away. It's one of the reasons that venture capital firms, law firms, and universities make really good anchors, because VCs want to give up their equity investments and find a new one after some years. And law firms, well, they bill hourly, basically. They want clients. And universities, well, done right, something from lunch today, university engagement in these regions works best when universities work like traditional universities, not like cut-rate venture capitalists or law firms. Right? Which means that their primary interest is not necessarily in dominating the region, right? It's in partnerships that are generative of lots of different things. So, I think that's it. Here are the set of papers. Like I said, I'm happy to share these. These are all available on my website if you want to see them. Happy to talk. Thanks very much for bringing me in.